All right, guys, so today we are going to look at the English Civil War. So, this is a little confusing, so you have to kind of pay close attention to what I'm about to tell you about where to find your guided notes for today. So, you actually already have these guided notes from January 31st when we first started talking about absolutism. So, you'll need to pull up those notes. If you remember, we stopped early. We talked about the 5 ways that absolute monarchs showcase their power or use power. So you'll need to pull up those same notes from 131. Here it is, you can see it. And then the link to the notes is, of course, at the top, like always. So if you scroll down about midway through the notes, you should be able to find this. So once again, you already have these notes from January 31st, so you should be able to look in your Google Drive. You've already made a copy of them and continue them right here where it says English Civil War. So this is where we are picking it up. I'm doing this a little different. Usually I put this together, but we split it up this year just to make things a little bit easier on you guys. All right, so we are going to look at the English Civil War. So far we have talked about absolute monarchs and how they exercise their power. We've looked at the changes in traditional authority and the way of thinking with the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. And so we are going to see how those things influence the English Civil War because we're going to start getting into revolutions. And so, in a way, this is a revolution. We are going to be talking about Civil War, but this is also going to segue us into later on the French Revolution and the challenge of traditional authority. All right, so a little bit of review on England. So, when we talked about the formation of England's government back in Unit 3, we talked about the Magna Carta and how when the Magna Carta was first signed in 1215, it limited King John's power. So he was no longer an absolute monarch. It created limitations in which he could not have absolute power. So England's monarchy is a limited monarchy or a constitutional monarchy. There is a constitution in place, which again has laws there to limit the monarch's power. So the first monarch that we're going to talk about with England and where we're picking up in the early 1600s is James the Sixth. James the Sixth is also James the First. So he was a cousin of Queen Elizabeth I, which was Henry VIII's um, daughter from his second marriage to Anne Boleyn. If you remember correctly, she did not get married, and so she didn't have an heir to the throne. So James was actually a monarch in Scotland. And so what she did is she named him her heir because they are cousins, they are related by blood. And so, therefore, when she names James her heir to the throne, that unites England and Scotland under one crown. So, the amount of territory that he actually controls is quite substantial. So, he succeeds Elizabeth in 1603. And if you remember, England at this time is also Protestant after the Protestant Reformation, after Henry VIII. And so when James comes to power in England, he is a Protestant already, and Protestantism has spread to Scotland. And so Protestantism is pretty dominant in Scotland. There are some Roman Catholics there, but when he gets to England, he really likes the way that the church is set up in England. He likes the fact that the monarch is the head of the Anglican church. And so when he comes to power, there are several waves of Protestantism and several different denominations of Protestantism. One of the most popular being the Puritans, and they are a very strict branch of Protestantism, but they wanted to make reforms to the Anglican Church. And if you remember, the Anglican Church isn't really that old at this point. Elizabeth I made it the official Church of England, and so he wasn't necessarily ready to make reforms to the church or challenge his power and authority in the church since he was the head of the Anglican Church. So he refused to make Puritan reforms. We're going to see this later on with his son, Charles I. This refusal to meet Puritan wants and needs, which Puritans do have their own parliament and some political power. We're going to see that that's going to cause trouble for Charles. So when James dies, his son Charles takes his place. Here's the thing about Charles. Charles doesn't necessarily like to act like a limited monarch. He doesn't like limitations on his power. He likes to go to war. So he likes spending a lot of money fighting these military battles. And every time you go to war, we've talked about this several times, war costs money, right? So you have to raise taxes. So when Parliament eventually starts to tell Charles that he cannot continue to go to war, they try to limit his ability to raise taxes, right? The more you raise taxes on the public, the more disgruntled the people become. So when Parliament refuses to increase taxes to meet the needs that he would, or the necessary financial needs that he would need for war, he just dissolves Parliament, which basically means he gets rid of it. So for a limited monarchy, this isn't really possible. He also tried to force Scotland to accept the Anglican prayer book, which for Scotland, since Mary Stuart, before she was beheaded, before she died, the previous ruler before James, he tried to force a lot of people in Scotland to accept the Anglican prayer book, but some people in Scotland were Catholic, and Scotland had been religiously tolerant for some time now, so that was very unfavorable with the Scottish people as well. So Charles, all in all, raises taxes, likes to fight wars, is trying to force the Anglican prayer book on those in Scotland, also those of other Protestant faiths in Scotland, and so he was wildly unpopular. So finally, in 1641, um, Parliament decides that they are going to pass laws that limit Charles's power. Remember, he tries to dissolve Parliament. It's not really possible in a limited monarchy. And so, in retaliation, the king tries to arrest Parliament, but they rebel. And this is what starts the English Civil War. Okay, so we have loyalists or royalists, which are loyal to the crown. They're also known as the Cavaliers. So you'll see them as loyalists, meaning they're loyal to the royal family. They're also called royalists or the Cavaliers. And he raises an army against the rebels, which is the Puritans. So if you remember from Charles I, the Puritans really wanted to make changes to the Anglican Church. And so these are the people that Charles is fighting. So you basically have people who support the crown against people who don't support the crown fighting against each other in England. So hence the English Civil War. They're both English at the end of the day. They're fighting each other. So the Puritans were led by General Oliver Cromwell, and this goes on for some time. But unfortunately, in 1649, the Loyalists lose the English Civil War, and Charles is arrested and executed. So we need to pause here for a second because this is actually in itself a really big deal. Um, Typically, monarchs are not executed, they are seen as anointed by God. So to execute a monarch is a huge deal. This has not been done in English history, not to a male monarch. Now, you might remember that Henry VIII beheaded a couple of his wives, but to the male heir of the throne, the sole monarch in which the power is passed down to, this has not happened before. So in 1649, when Charles is beheaded, this is pretty radical. So after he's beheaded, this is pretty much the end, temporarily, of the monarchy. And so Cromwell, the guy who was leading the parliamentary army, abolishes the monarchy and he establishes a commonwealth. A commonwealth is basically just a republic. Um, it's one functioning government that functions as a republic. And so when Cromwell comes to power, he uses the military as a way to create this commonwealth to reinforce his power. So he kind of rules as a religious military dictator. And he places a lot of Puritan laws or puts a lot of Puritan laws into place. So England's not exactly like the best place to be in the Commonwealth ruled by Cromwell, which is why in 1658, when he dies, the Commonwealth dies with him as well. So Charles I died, he was beheaded, the monarchy ended when Cromwell took over and established a commonwealth. When he dies, the commonwealth wasn't very popular. That ends. And so what Parliament does is basically say, okay, well, what can we do? And they decide to restore the monarchy. So how do you do that? You place somebody who was close relation in blood to the previous monarch. Charles I had a couple of children. And so they ask his son, Charles II, to return as king. Charles II is great. He gave back more rights to Parliament and English citizens. He rules as a limited monarch should. When he dies, his son, James II, comes to power. He is Catholic. Pause. This is a problem. Because if you remember, England is Protestant. And so Because he's Catholic, Catholics strongly support also absolute monarchy. And so he tries to take more power, tries to dissolve parliament, which, if you remember, with Charles I, was not popular. And so, because James II isn't a popular ruler, he's also not following the guidelines in which the limited monarchy is established in England. So, Parliament basically asked another powerful ruler and somebody also close in line to James to come take power. He has an aunt, Mary, who is married to this Dutch prince named William of Orange. And basically, Parliament asked William of Orange to bring his military, which the Dutch are very powerful at this point due to trade. And they're very wealthy and they have a large army. And so they basically asked William to bring his military to England and get rid of James. And so when the Dutch arrive, James just flees the scene. So this really isn't necessarily this isn't a bloody fight at all. This is a bloodless revolution. This is why we call it the Glorious Revolution. And so the revolution or the change that is occurring is that James II, the really unpopular ruler, flees England and William and Mary become the monarchs. Now, when William and Mary become the king and queen of England, they have to agree, of course, to again place more limitations on the monarch's power so that they can assume power in England, which they both agree to. And so this is where we're going to kind of lead this off. So the two things that you need to know the difference between in this unit are the English Civil War, that's when Charles I is beheaded, and then the Glorious Revolution. The Glorious Revolution is the bloodless exchange of power from James II to William of Orange and his wife Mary, which Mary was the sister of Charles. So she was closely related by blood. Or sorry, not. She was the sister of Charles II, daughter of Charles I. So she was closely related by blood. So this is why Parliament had particularly asked her and William of Orange. They didn't just ask a random person who was not necessarily related to the English monarchy. Okay, so this is where we're going to lead off. So when we look at the impact of absolutism, absolutism we're going to see after the English Civil War is going to start to crumble. And so we're going to see this with the French Revolution as well. Europeans feel super overburdened by the heavy taxes, the war, the fact that they are having to basically listen to the absolute monarchs when they have unlimited power. The nobility is particularly powerful as well because they are allied with the monarchs. And so we're going to see a power struggle here between the lower social classes and that of these older established aristocratic social classes, which is what we're kind of getting when we get to the French Revolution as well. So the importance of the English Civil War and the Glorious Revolution is that it's a challenge to traditional authority. We're seeing that the people in England are able to change their form of government a few times and also limit the power of their monarch. They were also able to, at one point, behead a monarch. So these are all really important things because we're going to see these patterns reoccur with not only the American Revolution, but also the French Revolution.